It's my privilege to welcome you to this first session of the 2017 Red Meat Industry Forum, held in conjunction with Meat and Livestock Australia's AGM. The Centralian beef industry really appreciates, firstly, the time out of your schedules to come here, and secondly, the cost. Now, as locals, we appreciate, for some reason, Qantas has this ability to ramp up the cost of airfares for special occasions, and especially when it's school holiday time or major sporting events. They have this ability to double this airfares. You know, it's cheaper to fly overseas than it is to fly from here to a capital city. And he gets a $25 million pay packet. There's probably a lot more of you that have never been out here before, so I thought I would delight you with some fun facts about Central Australia. Alice Springs has a population of approximately 29,000 head, and it sits 200 kilometres north of the dead centre of Australia. The country is best described as arid to semi-arid, and covers an area from the WA border to the Queensland border, south of the SA border, and about 300 kilometres north. Average rainfall ranges from 100 millimetres in the south to 350 in the north, but given where we live, that rainfall can be as high as 1,000 millimetres or zip. The pastoral estate covers an area of approximately 240,000 square kilometres and is running in the vicinity of 350,000 head. The breakdown of land types includes 140,000 square kilometres of spinifex and sand plains, running to the better country, 800 square kilometres of mitchell grass plains. Probably the most common land type would be the open woodland, supporting oat and umbrella grasses, but in that mix there's also 30,000 square kilometres of mulga country and 20,000 square kilometres of gidgee country. There are around 64 operations in the district, which are all family run, or traditionally family run, but although just of late we've had investment from the Philippines, and from Canada. Sanders are the most popular breed, with an average herd size in the place of about 5,500 head. So Sanders is the most popular breed, and running with Herefords, Shorthorns, Angus, some Murray Greys, and also a sprinkling of Browdies and Brahmans. Trapping accounts for 80% of the way cattle are mustered. It's not unusual to achieve 150 kilos of growth per year, and in a good season that can be upwards to 200 kilos a year. And given our geographical location, we have markets in every corner of the country, and for all types of markets. So it doesn't matter whether it's EU, MSA, organics, the whole lot. Bullocks on occasions have actually gone across the middle through Laverton to Perth. Our nearest processors are Livingston, just to the south of Darwin, and the nearest processor south is Murray Bridge, 1,600 k's south. It will come as no surprise, issues affecting profitability are seasons and the shortage of labour, and the main land management problems are feral animals and woody weeds. Other totally irrelevant information: the McDonald Ranges were once, there's the ranges here that to the south of the town, were once higher than the Himalayas, and that was a long time ago. In the megafauna era, which was about 10 million years ago, there was, they told me there was 6 to 8 inches more rain per year, and the temperature was 10 to 15 degrees cooler. There's a fossil out of a megafauna dig on Alcuda, and it's a fossil of a big bird. The bird was 10 to 12 feet high. It could motor along at 40 kilometres an hour. It weighed 6 to 700 kilos, and the females had eggs the size of medicine balls. Imagine hitting that basket again. So that's it for the history lesson. Now for today's program. The first session of the 2017 Red Meat Industry Forum is hosted by the Red Meat Advisory Council, and is about how industry policymakers are working for Australia as a whole, for for Central and Northern Australia in particular. We'll break at 11:30 for a catch-up. We'll have some lunch and check out the trade show. Please note, MLA members wishing to attend the AGM must register to do so. No dual citizens. After lunch, this forum will reconvene at 1 o'clock for session 2, where MLA will provide analysis of current global demand trends and an examination of the implications for our industry, followed by an open Q&A session. We'll break again briefly at 2:45 for afternoon tea before convening with MLA's AGM. So we'll make a start with this session. I'd like to introduce you to Don Mackay, the Chair of RMAC, for his address. After Don's address, we'll be taking questions from the floor to all the panel members. Thank you, Don.
Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome to everybody. And again, extending the thanks of the whole red meat industry for hosting us here in Alice. I'm sure Richard and Michelle will talk about this later, but this is a terrific roll-up of people, and I think much larger than we've seen at any of these events in recent times. And maybe that's a reflection of a great place to visit, and perhaps a reflection of some good times in general within the red meat sector. So, but we're very pleased that you could be here. And particular thanks to Chris. I'm probably premature in thanking him because you might ask hard questions, but Chris is obviously a strong advocate for the industry in this part of Australia, and we're very pleased that he's been able to take the time to be involved and to MC this session. Because what we want to do today is hear from you. We've tended in these events to speak to you about what we think you want to hear and about what we're doing, but we're changing the format, so don't let us down. Make sure you ask some questions. Difficult questions should be directed at the people here. Simple questions are directed to me. So I've already instructed Chris how to do that. So firstly, I'd like to talk about a few key issues and opportunities for our industry. Some of these are my views, so I'll be a little bit controversial at times, hoping to spark some good discussion and debate. But firstly, who the hell is RMAC? The red meat industry has suffered from, I guess, a view that this is complicated. It's not really. But in this section of industry, the Red Meat Advisory Council, is where the whole of industry comes together and collaborates and discusses and manages cross-sector issues and opportunities. And a key example of that is the free trade agreements that have been successfully negotiated over the last couple of years, where under the auspices of RMAC and with the assistance of the service providers and particularly MLA, we have task forces that provide direct information and direction on behalf of the whole of industry on what our positions are on trade. And I think that's been an enormous benefit to the industry, with the particular examples of China, Japan and South Korea, where I think we did reasonably well. In fact, in some cases we did extremely well, and well in advance of some other agricultural sectors. So if you speak with one voice, it's very easy for government to listen. So that's been an important part of that. Another is around integrity systems. And I'm sure that MLA will talk about that, and if we don't get a question about it, I'll be surprised. But we really are trying to prosecute the case for the importance of those systems, and I'll talk a bit more about why that is. Because we have a great opportunity here within Australia to enjoy the benefits of an industry that can do things that others can't. So it's really up to us and this group of people and you to participate in that. Another part of what we do is to develop the strategic industry strategic plan, or the MISP as we call it, 2020. It's been a 5-year plan. It will move to 10, which is I think more obviously a long-term plan and not just an operation plan. So that process has been completed some few years ago. We're now in the middle, and we're in fact doing an assessment of that plan as we speak. The other is we manage the industry reserve funds of some $42 or $43 million, and the income from that fund, and it's managed very conservatively and prudently, and the income from that funds the peak industry councils, or a percentage of that of their cost of running, to represent you on behalf of the whole of industry and you to government in particular around policy and policy development. And RMAC does in fact advise the government on key issues in a direct sense. So the Red Meat Advisory Council, as it says, it's a council which is charged with the responsibility of providing advice to the Minister of the day. In this case, as I stand here, it's the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who is acting Minister for the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources. So that's the role of us. And before I proceed, I'll just talk about who they are. Alan Piggott is the absolutely brand spanking new President of the Sheep Producers Australia, the newly constituted body, and I give them great credit for moving and getting the job done. It's fantastic, and we thank Alan for being here. Howard Smith, who is the President of Cattle Council Australia. Rick Gates, who is the President of the Goat Industry Council of Australia. Tess Herbert, President of the Australian Lot Feeders Association. The Honourable Simon Crean, Chairman of the Australian Live Exporters Council. James Campbell and Lockie Hart, both from the Australian Meat Industry Council, representing the processing sector. So as you can see, we represent the whole of it, not just production, but right through to including feedlotting and including meat processing and retail, because AMIC represents a very, very substantial amount of the retail sector as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that, what it really means. So to put this in a context which I think is important, is that we are really important to the Australian economy and to its communities. And we have just very recently, in conjunction with MLA and working with Ernst & Young, have provided a snapshot of the industry called the State of the Industry Report, which is available, and it talks about what this industry really does and what it means, which gives us an opportunity to work with government so they do really understand how important this industry is. We launched that report in Parliament House a few weeks ago, and the Deputy Prime Minister and Barnaby Joyce and the Minister for Trade, Stephen Chobo, assisted in that launch, and Minister Chobo then found somebody who asked him a question in question time, which is the way things happen, and he gave our industry a terrific hearing on the floor of Parliament, which I thought was a wonderful thing for us to achieve. So we all produce meat, we eat it, we work in the industry, and we supply that product to millions of customers all around the world. We are the leading exporter of beef and goat meat, and we are second only to New Zealand in the exporting of sheep meats. While acknowledging that the consumption of red meat in Australia has fallen, as it has in many parts of the world, and I don't think we should be beating ourselves up about that. The world has changed. I grew up about 50 kilometres north of Brewarrina in Western New South Wales, and I ate mutton for breakfast, lunch and dinner. But that's changed. But what we are, of course, is that we do eat 4 times more beef and 6 times more sheep meat compared to the average of the rest of the world. So we are still very large consumers of red meat. It's a unique industry, it's an iconic industry that has very strong economic credentials, and it's continuing to grow. It employs over 405,000 people, directly and indirectly, and contributes $18 billion to the GDP. And it's enjoyed an 11% growth. And I think in my time in this industry, which is a long time, I've never seen cattle, sheep, goat, wool prices all at record levels. Now we may say it's still not enough and costs have increased, but from my perspective that's been quite unusual. If we can combine it with a good season like we've got here in the centre, then we're all in a good place. It's a network of some 75,000 businesses that have experienced 5% growth as well. So our success story is Australia's success story, and it's an important part of how we live and how we live our lives. Australian business people and consumers are really now recognising how important this is, and when we talk a little bit later about investment, investors really do understand how important this industry is. So a few key issues from me. Firstly, industry investment. Investment in this sector has been inadequate, particularly in production, for a long time. It has relied very heavily on debt for growth, and we clearly need to involve the increased injection of equity into our businesses. Very few Australian funds invest directly into agriculture. A few exceptions. Macquarie Bank, QIC, and AMP has been in, then out, and I think got in again. And I think in its recent sale of the Sustainable Ag Fund is probably now back out. But when you go overseas, that's not the message that you get. And I've travelled the world raising capital, and it's a very easy story to tell, the story of Australian agriculture. Unfortunately, a lot of funds in this country don't recognise the long-term nature and the safety of investments in agricultural land and agricultural businesses. As I said, the international investors get the story, and we're certainly seeing a lot of that. And that story is around clean, safe food and taking a long-term view of that investment. Overseas investment has been and will remain a critical element for the development of our industry. Major investors over the years, and particularly in the north, we've seen the British come and go, we've seen the US, the Japanese, we've seen the Koreans, and now we're seeing additional investment from the United States, from China, Canada, Europe, the Middle East, and more recently in an acquisition of a large genetics business in Queensland and New South Wales, New Zealand pension funds. So New Zealanders get it. Unfortunately, we're not seeing enough of it from here. We have a very low threshold of $15 million for FIRB approval, which is, I think, ridiculously low. And unfortunately, there's been too much political noise around, which is also concerning investors. And I'm speaking at the Global Ag Invest Conference in London in a couple of weeks, and I have no doubt that'll be some of the questions I'll get. Whilst we all are concerned about sometimes foreign investment, this business would not survive unless we had that capital. In a country of 27 million people, there's just not enough of it here. Secondly, productivity improvement. To a large degree, it's stalled. There's been great work done in research and development by industry and by MLA in particular in the sector that we're involved in, and AMPC and LiveCorp. And there's been excellent support from government. So the matching funds, which we applaud government, and both sides have maintained their commitment to that, and we find that to be a vital element. However, extension and adoption remains quite poor. Governments, particularly the states, have walked away from this essential activity. I will say, where I'm standing here in the middle of the NT, that's probably a little bit of an exception, because I would believe that there's probably more from the government departments in this part of the world than others. And industry has not yet picked up the ball. Intensive industries are somewhat the exception. They understand their costs, and they're very, very fast adopters of technology. Feedlots, for example, processing, intensive farming. I'm involved in cotton and grain, and within minutes of something coming available, the industry grabs it and runs with it. And I think that's a terrific thing, and we need to make sure we have that same mindset in the production of our red meat. So this area will be a significant focus for us up here on the stage at RMAC and its members over the near term, and we're working with government, and we're certainly working with our service providers on making sure that we have enough extension so that we can get the adoption of the sort of work that's already been done. There is an argument for reduction in R&D and increase in extension. You can't stop improving, so it's vital that we get everybody on that same train. Thirdly, our industry has come under significant scrutiny in recent times. We've had 2 Senate committee reviews. We've had a review by the ACCC. We must, as an industry, recognise any shortcomings that we have and look for constant improvement. However, our industry does not deserve the disproportionate commentary it has received following these reports. Industry is very largely functioning very well, with strong competition and good pricing. It's competitive, but unfortunately our industry has had a combative style of relationship between production and other parts of the chain. That traditional process is changing, and I think we need to make sure we change it as fast as we can. We have to be part of supply chains. If you can't have your own brand, be part of one. If you're involved in a supply chain, then there is a commitment and a relationship between all those people that shares information and can share rewards, rather than the combative style that we've all grown up with. There is lower price volatility, and I think is really the success, the future for us in terms of running successful operations, where you can lower the volatility and the risk associated with our business with the massive investments we've got. There are many levels of competence within our industry, particularly at the production level, and we cannot and should not, I guess, accept the imposition of regulation or the dilution of systems that seek to take the industry to its lowest common denominator at the expense of the bulk of industry. Like all industries, we need to accept that there are poor performers who will fail, and there are better performers who will grow. And this is how our industry will improve. We have to understand that and be part of accepting and moving, because if we can have the good operators getting bigger and stronger, they will employ more people and certainly produce more production. Finally, we are now the largest trade-exposed manufacturing industry in this country. With the last car rolling out the assembly lines in South Australia and the textile industries falling by the wayside many years ago, this is the big one. So we're now in an enviable position to capture the market opportunities that are coming our way. We can provide the high quality, safe food that so many of our customers, both domestically and around the world, need. We won't be the cheapest protein supplier. We haven't been and we won't be. We can't produce lean meat for buckseye balls in Indonesia the way that the Indian production system can do. But what we are is we are already the world's only really major exporting country that can send high quality, safe production into all these countries. Our integrity systems are the envy of the world and must be constantly improved, not watered down. And for me, that's an important element which I'd like to touch on a little more. I know there are concerns around things like the LPA, biosecurity, welfare. There's no doubt at all that if you're operating in your own business, sometimes it's hard to connect that through to why is this happening to me? Those things, when you travel overseas to talk to the customers of the world, these things are very important. And they're very important for every part of the business, whether you've got 10 head of cattle or 200,000, or you've got 10 sheep or 200,000, or 10 goats or 200,000. Every single time there's a mistake made in the industry, it affects the whole of industry. So these integrity systems are vital, and I implore everybody to get on board and be part of what will be the point of difference for our industry over all these other countries that are running subsidised or cheap production systems, because we can't do that. So our focus on sustainability through the Beef Sustainability Framework, and I'd ask you to call and visit. We have a stand outside. And there will be also an addition of sheep over time to that process. That will add to our ability to supply that high quality, verifiable product that the world really is demanding. The things that define a great, vibrant industry are being prepared to constantly examine your business, recognise your shortcomings, make changes, look for constant improvement, know what your customers want now, and consider what they'll want in the future. The brand promise of Australian red meat is second to none. It starts with True Aussie, and it goes right through to the proprietary brands of the large and small operators that really make this business hum. It's very hard to replicate. So being prepared to do what is needed through investment and acceptance of investment, through research and development, through marketing, and very importantly, through that extension and adoption that I've spoken about, will see this industry to continue to grow, continue to rise, and be the standard bearer for sustainable and profitable red meat production around the world. I'd now like to hand back to Chris and ask Chris to moderate a session which engages with all of you, directing questions to all the members of the board, because this board does represent all the councils that work for you in all those sectors, whether it's in production, in feedlotting, live exporting or processing. So here's your chance. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope I've stimulated some thoughts, and I look forward to some good questions from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Don. I'd like to take you up on that point about the territory government, especially the Ag Department. They are really helpful in this country. I sat with NABRAC for a while, and the feedback we got there was the Queensland departments were withdrawing their extension services, and we in the territory were maintaining our levels, so we were getting a good response from them. Probably not so much the roads, though. We lack a bit in the road department. Don, I'd like to take you up on another point there too. The brands. There was the conference, Smart Beef conference at Armidale. There was a lot of talk about brands. It's certainly I couldn't understand how we could fit into a brand, but we are all part of the Australian brand, and if 73% of our product is exported, then that's the brand that we're part of. Howard, mate, I hear along the grapevine there's 500,000 coming our way for the restructure. Is that right? Could you help us explain what the process is going to be and where to from here?
Yeah, Chris, thanks for the question. Cattle Council, among others, there was 27 successful applicants for the Rural Leadership Fund of $5 million. We were successful in getting 500,000 of that. That will help us go forward and give us some resources to what we're looking at is transitioning to the direct elected model, which is obviously came out of the Senate inquiry 3 or 4 years ago. Right, Ben. So basically we were successful, as I said before, of getting this fund. This will be used for predominantly governance, looking at structure and consultation. There are caveats around what you can use this money for. So yes, it's certainly a great result to get this, but we've still got a long way to go. We still need to look at how we're going to long-term sustainable funding of Cattle Australia for the direct elected model. But we're in talks with other stakeholders at the moment how we could possibly achieve that. One of our goals from CCA is hopefully by the AGM next year, MLA AGM, that we could have the ability that we've already had a vote to select the people from the 15 regions to develop the new Cattle Australia.
Right, thanks Howard. For those of you who want to ask questions, the microphones, there's 2 microphones in each laneway there. Any questions for Howard? Or anybody? Could you say your name please and where you're from?
James Jackson from up in New England. My question is probably to the livestock guys up there, and that is, I've had a concern for some time about how the red meat industry is actually handling the issue of welfare, and welfare is been handled in a very reactive sense. You know, you've been to one too many social licence, you know, seminars put on by Future Eye, and you know, you're essentially reacting to an agenda set by animal liberationists. And that is, I would suspect that is a very dangerous thing. Now, speaking to the shadow ag minister who's going to set up this independent officer of animal welfare, we've got the prospect of an independent office of animal welfare that's based on that very thing, a reactive type premise, rather than, you know, the OIE definition of animal welfare, which is actually about the animal. It's not about any sort of human interpretation of the animal's experience. So I think it's in the interest of industry to actually have an animal welfare model that is actually based on the animal. It's based on productivity. It's related to a lot of things that we do, you know, including things like the MSA program, rather than you know, focus on analgesics, rather than focus on a sort of a reactive process of looking at aversive, you know, husbandry procedures. You know, this is the agenda that's been set by Animal Australia. You're not being proactive in actually setting the agenda. So I'm just interested in your view on whether, you need to change how you look at animal welfare.
Yeah, thanks. I would have thought we have been recently reasonably proactive. In fact, that we put one of the extra modules on LPA is the National Standards and Guidelines for Animal Welfare, which has taken a long time to get agreement with, and I think that's been a positive outcome. And that was negotiated, those standards and guidelines, with industry and also with RSPCA and others. I think that's a good first step, but I take your point. I'm happy for someone else to comment, but I think that was, by being proactive, by adding that other module, is getting awareness to producers and demonstrating that we take welfare seriously in this country.
Simon, you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. Is that on? You're on. Okay. We've been very active on a number of fronts. First of all, we have been calling for the government to initiate a review into ACIL, the standards for the carrying of animals within Australia, and finally we got them to announce that review this year. So we're going on the front foot. We've engaged with the vets, the animal welfare vets, to identify holes in the system at the moment where that can be addressed, and Live Corp has done some really good work in bringing together the work that was done some years ago that identified where the differences were on this, as to how we can go forward in a positive way to improve on that front, to be proactive. Now that's within Australia. Of course, the animal welfare issue came to a head in terms of the export of live animals with the bloody business, the Four Corners program, closure of the trade in 2011. But since that time, again, I agree with you, we need to be proactive, but indeed we have been. This last week in Perth, the annual meeting of ALEC members endorsed unanimously proceeding to develop a global assurance program for animal welfare. We have SCAS, and that was the consequence of what happened in 2011, but the fundamental problem with SCAS, whilst it does pay attention to the welfare of animals in a way that no other country does, and we're the only country in the world that has to export our animals where the exporter is responsible for the welfare of the animal up to the point of slaughter. No other country does that, and there are 130 countries in the world that in fact export animals. What we're about doing is requiring the facilities in country to take more responsibility for the welfare of animals. That means improving the control and traceability systems. Last week's motion, resolution, unanimous as I say, agreed to proceed to establish the LGAP company, but to also do further work on more effective control and traceability systems. And that is work that will be done in the next couple of months. Third area where I think we're also being proactive is saying, why are we the only country that should have to have this responsibility? And if in fact we're entering into trade negotiations, trade agreements on regional bases, but also now in Europe, and I'm involved with the negotiations around the European Free Trade Agreement, why not us be saying to the Europeans, you embrace these standards that our exporters embrace? Not only does it restore a competitive position, but it is actually going on the front foot with the importance of welfare in the supply chain. Now, that's still work in progress, but all of this has been the agenda that we have been pursuing. I might say also that OIE, the international body that you referred to, recognises Australia's animal welfare system as world leading. Well, we want it to be embraced by the world. We won't do that until we get the proper systems in place, until we ensure control and traceability through the supply chain. The whole function of RMAC is to get supply chain integrated, working together models, and that's what we're seeking to do in terms of the welfare. So on both fronts, domestically and internationally, Australia is being very proactive, and I'm proud to say the industry is taking a lead in that proactivity.
Don, you got something to add?
Thank you. I'd just like to add something further if I could, and thanks James, I do appreciate the question because I think it's one of the really important things that we've got to deal with, and I don't see us being defensive to your question at all, because we haven't got it all right yet by a long shot, and I don't think our communication of the importance of this to the whole sector has been adequate in my view, and I think the LPA example is a very prime example of why we're doing this. Why is that module there? We need to make sure that everybody understands absolutely. So this is not just simply about protecting our position, but as Simon has said, this is all about the things I spoke about of putting us in a preeminent position. Because if you go into Europe and the Argentinians and the Brazilians are all wanting to charge through the same door, and I'll say that's fine, come through the door, but these are the rules to come. And we are better placed to do that than anywhere else. And one of the things that I think that has been I'll make 2 points. One, at Smart Beef the other day, which Chris referred to, I said I was sort of late to the party in accepting and understanding that whole concept that the elected representatives didn't control us, but the people did. And, that's changed because of, this little thing and among other things. So I've accepted that and moved on. But what I haven't moved on is that we work closely with people like RSPCA. But I won't engage with somebody who wants to close you down. We've got to understand why they want to close you down, but the Animals of Australia and those sort of people, to me, they're just not the right source. And I had this debate with a lady who was trying to beat me up at the World Meat Congress some years ago as she stood in leather shoes and leather belt. The concept was lost on her, I must say. But it's a great question, and let me tell you, everybody up here is focused very closely on it.
So Tess, you lot feeders, yep.
Is that working? No.
Yeah, it'll just talk to it. Turn it around.
If I could make a response quickly, and thank you both to Chris and Don for the Smart Beef plug. That was Alpha's annual conference and our AGM held 2 weeks ago, and phenomenally successful. And again, thanks James for the question, because animal welfare is front of mind for all of us along the supply chain. Animal welfare is really not negotiable. On a couple of levels. Our customers are demanding it, as Don would know, and he gives the example of overseas customers who are requiring increased animal welfare standards and guidelines around our product. But it's also on a values level, and it's something I agree we need to get our heads around how that looks. Within our industry, we liaise with the RSPCA at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. What we're trying to do is to be on the front foot and be proactive and figure out what are our stakeholders saying about our production system. And we recognise that as an intensive industry that may be more challenging. We've introduced, I absolutely applaud industry for the two new LPA modules. I believe it starts with being underpinned by our standards and guidelines, and then the LPA modules on animal welfare and biosecurity work further to enhance that, and to work with animal welfare right across the supply chain. We can all individually do what we do in the animal welfare space, but it's really important across the supply chain that we all address our own issues. In the feedlot space, we have a quality assurance system called the National Feedlot Accreditation Scheme. Animal welfare is embedded into that as one of the modules. We've increased our animal welfare standards within NFAS just recently, and it won't go away. I can't imagine us ever taking an animal welfare standard out of NFAS. It will increase. I think that's just the reality of where that space around animal welfare is. I think industry is actually being remarkably proactive in this space, but I agree we need to do more. We need to be more aware of what our stakeholders are saying to us. We need to engage. We need to figure out what they're seeing that maybe we aren't if we're too close to it. And I think we're heading along the right track, but I agree we need to do more.
Thank you.
Chris, if I could just close out the supply chain. From a processor's point of view, the processing industry has adopted animal welfare standards, a voluntary standard, but currently 84% of all cattle slaughtered or animals slaughtered in our processing plants are going through an accredited plant. And we're now starting to see that accreditation being adopted by some of our end user customers around the world, but also here in Australia, with the retailer Aldi making that as a prerequisite for supply into their stores.
Right, thanks, Ian. That gives you the answer, James? Right.
There is a critical thing that I think Don's missed there. The RSPCA do have national policy to phase out the live export business. So the idea that you're only dealing with people who, you know, are supporting our industry, I think is challengeable on that fact alone. I mean, the RSPCA have been consumed by animal liberationists. I mean, I think you've got to be very careful dealing with them. They've got a very reactive, you know, approach to animal welfare, and it's very much focused on husbandry interventions. It's not focused on the animal's experience at all. So the OIE definition, have a look at that panel, because what we're doing in animal welfare, not only in the red meat industry but across animal ag in Australia, is not actually animal welfare. It's a conflation of social licence theory and animal welfare, and they're not the same thing. So just be careful what you're doing, because you could be damaging the ability to actually frame this independent office of animal welfare to actually be an animal welfare office rather than a social licence office. So be very careful about that.
Right, thanks, James. We have a question down there at 4.
Thanks, Chairman. Ian McColl, farmer, New South Wales. Don, you said you wanted the easy questions, so I'll throw an easy question at you. You mentioned in your speech the combative relationships that we have within the industry, and I think as producers we'd all agree that if we could have better relationships and perhaps a greater trust through the whole supply chain, and there's no point throwing stones at anyone, we're all guilty of it at certain stages, saying, well, yeah, someone else in the industry is doing better than we are. I was interested in your thoughts as to how we might address that.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, that easy question. The reality is that if you look at, but it's a question that has to be answered, is the point. If you look at, and I'll be interested from Lockie or James and perhaps Tess commenting about this, because I think it's one of the key components of what will make us better. If you talk to people, and I'm sure there are plenty in this room, who have got long-term relationships with the next point in the chain in their business. They're getting strong feedback, they're making decisions based on that feedback. They are not always getting the high price, but they're not getting the low price. That they're working with that person, they have a level of trust. And that's where I think we're moving. Now, whether, you know, not everybody's going to get there, I accept that, but a large chunk of industry has to do that. And I'm sure if you talk to, and I'm sure Lockie or James or Tess or someone will talk about this, but those people who have got those relationships now, they're not the ones complaining. They're not concerned about these issues. They're working feverishly on improving their business. So that's the way to do it. As I said at Smart Beef around brands, you just simply can't all have your own brand. If you try and brand a commodity product, you'll just be dearer than the bigger operator. So you've got to be part of someone else's or have something with a point of difference. Australia has a general point of difference, which I think is the point that you picked up on, Chris, around brands, because we've got a brand that is absolutely second to none, and we've got to be part of that. But at an individual level, it's getting part of a chain. So, Chris, with your indulgence, maybe some others might like to comment on that.
Lockie, James?
Thanks, Don, and thanks, Ian, for the question. Look, there's no doubt, I was part of the infamous Senator Barry O'Sullivan tour of central Queensland, and to have a processor represented on that tour, I was sort of expecting that we were going to, I was going to receive a fair bit of feedback from the producers with regards to their relationships with processors, because it was at the time when I think the processing sector was under a lot of pressure from the senators and the inquiries that were happening. But I've got to say that a lot of the feedback wasn't necessarily about the processes in that particular case, it was probably more about representatives, the representation and ensuring that the voice of producers was getting carried through to government or to the decision makers. And I can say from that, I think the industry has moved forward. We have, no doubt, learnt a lot from the ACCC inquiries. We've learnt a lot from the Senate inquiries. And I think the real thing is, I think as leaders of this industry, there needs to be a lot more collaboration. There needs to be a lot more consultation up and down the supply chain. You are starting to see quite obviously, you know, processes going forward. I understand at breakfast this morning that Tom gave a very good presentation about what they are doing as an organisation to develop that level of trust that you referred to, Ian. I think from AMIC's perspective, our processes, we understand that we are just a part of a supply chain, that we do have agricultural inputs, which are cattle and sheep and goats, and we need to collaborate up and down that supply chain to ensure that not only is this industry sustainable, but you know, every sector is going to hopefully iron out these boom and bust cycles that we currently experience. And our businesses can go forward.
Righto.
Sorry, if I could make a quick comment, if this comes on.
It will.
Yep.
It will. Just from our perspective, look, Ian, it's from a feedlot perspective, it doesn't generally tend to be a combative relationship. Along this table here, we're all customers and suppliers of each other, and I think there's a recognition along the supply chain generally that we need each other to survive. Acknowledging the vagaries of the market, and they exist and they will continue to exist, but it's in no one's best interest for any part of this supply chain to fall over. So I think we need to recognise that often you're talking to a customer, not the enemy, and treat each other accordingly.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a comment. And that's fine. I think we're heading in the right direction, but we really need to have a mature conversation that we don't get the repeats and the cycles that we had 3 or 4 years ago. Either one sector's winning and the other one's losing. When are we going to one day have a mature debate and say, let's look at policy that tries to iron those lumps out? And I'm not saying we can get rid of volatility to that degree, but there's got to be somewhere along here that we're all in this together, and we don't keep seeing when one's winning, the other one's losing.
Yeah, thanks, Howard. And I reckon that's what came out of the breakfast meeting, was this notion of trust. And it's certainly for us producers around Central Australia, we've had a big trust issue with processors, and this implementation of DEXA might, well, it'll fix us or wipe us out, but we'll wait and see. Right, question there, please, at number 4.
John Buxton, livestock producer from Gippsland, Victoria. I've got a question for Howard Smith about this proposed cattle council restructure, or probably endless questions actually. First of all, I'll admit ignorance in terms of what's proposed, but regionally elected representatives, elected by who? How do I get to have a vote? How do I get to nominate if I want to put my hand up? Who will those representatives be answerable to? Does my normal communications channel through my state farmer organisation become redundant in terms of my ability to influence the process? Does my membership become redundant?
I reckon we might pull it up there, thank you.
Yeah, and how's it going to be funded? Do the people who get elected fund it? Do they pay for their seats?
Righto, that's a fairly big question. So basically, I'll give a brief where we've come to. So initially we had the Senate inquiry that was instigated by the Deputy Prime Minister. There was recommendations out of that we go to a direct elected model. In February 2015, with the implementation committee that was led by Cattle Council, the Minister instructed Cattle Council to take the lead and consult with other stakeholders, other groups. We came up with a restructure of the 15 regions. There'll be 15 people democratically elected by all levy payers. They will then go from that 15 to a board of 7. then also to have the capacity of that board to have 2 skills-based people or an independent chair as well. This will be funded initially. There was talk of funding this by a portion of the levy. There's no appetite by the government to do that. We have prosecuted to get a portion of the levy. We've looked at multiple funding options, which is we're still working towards at the moment. As I alluded to before, we're looking at maybe an option of trying to come up with some sort of service type level agreement, which we have at the moment with Cattle Council. I think this, the SFO question, I think there's no reason that the SFOs can't participate in this, put their candidates forward in the regions. The 15 regions are loosely based on, we've halved the 32 ABARE regions, that's based on production. We had to start somewhere. I'm saying we could tweak some of that. Some of it might be a bit clunky, but that's sort of the concept. A lot of this funding that we've got now and working towards, there'll be more devil in the detail. The voting structure is one vote, one value is going to be how we vote through our levies now. All these things needed to be discussed and get to this point. But, you know, from industry and everything, we delivered this restructure to the Minister. He never thought, I think, that was ever going to happen. His comment to me, well, what's next? Peace in the Middle East. We actually delivered on that. He said then that you do that, we will find the funding. Well, we're still waiting.
Cattle Council's never been answerable to government, so why would you be bending over to do what they want?
So, bending over to do what they want. This
Cattle Council's not answerable to government.
No,
so why would you be jumping to their tune?
We're not jumping to their tune. From the Senate inquiry and the overwhelming desire from a lot of levy payers to have the ability to participate in a direct elected model.
Yeah, no, we might, we'll leave it there, thanks, because this, after seeing that Beef Central article, there's still a lot of angst out there regarding Cattle Council, and I feel for all the board members of Cattle Council, you fellas have got a tough job. Simon, I'd like to take up, no more questions, I'd like to take up sorry. Yep, sorry.
All the way here to ask this question. I have to, my name's Claire McMahon. I am a very small producer down at south of Eden, that's very close to the Victorian border on the coast, beautiful part of Australia. I say I'm a small producer. I would have 50 breeders and my helpers 2 tractors and a Kelpie dog. The problem we all have, especially on the far south coast, is feral deer, and trying to convince the government to call them a feral deer, not a game animal. Now, the protection that comes with the status of game animal means you can't shoot a deer half an hour before sunup, half an hour before sundown. You're not allowed to go after them in a motor vehicle. You can't hunt them with a dog. You must have, if you're not the farmer yourself, you must have a game licence. If you shoot in forestry or national parks, I think it's mostly forestry, I don't think you can shoot in national parks, you must have a recreation licence. All of those licences cost you another $70 on top of what you've got. Now, you can't spotlight them. So, some of the farms down at Kaya, where I come from, can have 90 to 100 deer grazing on their property every night. And what can you do? A farmer with a licence can do it. One of the guys at Jindabyne, he has 250. He can go out and he can shoot and spotlight. But he shoots 30
Claire,
a night.
can you get to the question,
yes,
please? Yes,
but if you don't understand the problem,
Righto.
you cannot understand what I'm asking. I joined a delegation through the Invasive Species Council to put pressure on the New South Wales government, and there's only 3 states that haven't declared them feral, to have them declared a feral animal, so everybody's obliged to get rid of them. What we're asking for now is for all of you to consider how much income is being eroded through that. I could say mine's 25,000. I could do with that to pay somebody. So what we're asking you to do is to consider, one, getting the New South Wales and Victorian government to declare the feral and not a game animal, and the government is dependent on 2 shooters parties to get it through, and they can't do it because it's shooters party.
Don, can you
I
help Claire out here, please?
I'll respond to that if I can. And I'll respond on the basis of significant experience. I was Managing Director of Ranges Valley, which is owned by Marubeni Corporation. I would estimate on the station we would have between 2,000 and 3,000. You could drive within 2 minutes of the homestead and see mobs of 100 charging through fences, so I understand your point. I think the best thing for me is to take this on notice. I will make, in fact, search me out somewhere and I'll talk to you about it later in the day, and I'll talk to people, because these are an introduced animal, exactly the same as rabbits and foxes and everything else. So we need to deal with it, and it's not just there. I can tell you they're in large proportions in Queensland. And they're certainly in the top end of the territory. So they're around everywhere, and there's no predators. They're just breeding up rapidly. So leave it to me. I'll talk to you.
I couldn't ask for more than that.
Okay.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, just a quick question back to Don. Jason Tromp, sheep and beef producer from northeast Victoria. Just this challenge around adoption and behavioural change. You've all invested, everyone along that panel's invested a lot of money in building known technologies and things that we know make a difference, yet adoption levels in a lot of cases are down to, say, often 5 and 10% of the ultimate user. I just wondered what, and that's where we get our payoff as an industry ultimately, what's your approach? What are you thinking of doing? So it's really a question just back to something you touched on in your presentation.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. If I go back to my experience in an agricultural agronomic services business, and I think one of the major shareholders is probably in the room, but that's in the cotton and broad-scale ag sector. So that business, we employ 15 or 20 thereabouts agronomists. So there's a very active, very well-developed consultancy sort of system in a lot of areas of agriculture. In the feedlot sector, no major feedlot does not have a consulting vet, does not have a nutritionist, is not being provided with, absolute up-to-date information every day. It's at their fingertips. So my view is that the governments are highly unlikely, with the exception of the NT who've maintained things, to pick this up. It's just not somewhere they'll go. So we collectively have got to work on providing some means by which commercial operators can be a part of this solution. I know a lot of production doesn't like to think about employing advisors or consultants. It's not necessarily where they'd like to go, but in most of the other sectors, and particularly intensive, it's a part of normal life. I think that's probably one of the ways we've got to do it. Where there's market failure, which I think there is market failure here, and we need to get some intervention to kickstart, then I think that's something we should certainly consider, and it's one that I've been raising around this table, and I'll continue to raise it around this table. So if we need to get some intervention from government or from industry funds or from whatever it might be to start something, then I'll prosecute that case, because we've got to get the adoption done. And some of this technology is 20 years old and we're still not doing it. And I think that's the disappointing part.
I just like getting back to this. I think we've got an opportunity here, and it sort of weaves into this restructure where I believe with our service providers, governments and departments, if we could get boots on the ground, and I've seen it before where and this getting back to this regional model, that's regional Pacific, and getting actually elected people from the New Cattle Australia to be in there, to be the point of contact, boots on the ground, and coordinate all these other groups. And I've seen it before. If you talk to most people and ask who's your R&D chairman in your region, most producers wouldn't have a clue. I've been to where MLA put days on, and depending on how it's executed and what region you can get a full house or you can get 2. And I think if we can get this more coordinated and stop the duplications and make sure everyone's working together, I think that we can get a better outcome.
Righto.
If I could respond quickly too. I agree with Howard, this is an enormous opportunity, the extension space. Don's right, our industry uses consultants. But in actual fact, we do a lot of the extension ourselves, and I know that's easier for us to do, we can capture, but we're still a national body. We still have to reach our members and our levy payers in every state, and we do that. I see an enormous opportunity for industry to maintain a touch point with our producers by offering extension services. Again, you're absolutely right. The number of R&D projects that sit on a shelf is disappointing, given that levy funds have gone into those. It's important that we get those R&D projects and the results of those out to producers. Alpha run 2 workshops and a conference every year, and that's part of what we do. If we change our standards, for example, our animal welfare standards in NFAS, we run a workshop, because we don't expect people to comply to a standard without informing them exactly what it's about. Extension is one of the most valuable tasks that we perform as the Peak Industry Council, and I see it as a huge opportunity for peak industry councils to touch our levy payers and our members.
Yeah, thanks, Tess. I know with my involvement with NABRAC, it's the number one problem is how to get adoption of R&D. Any questions? So, Simon, I'd like to take you to task on a Indonesian IACEPA benefit. A, can you tell me what that acronym is? And B, how's it going to help us with the live export?
It's a free trade agreement plus. It actually stands for Indonesia-Australia Closer Economic Partnership Agreement. The basis is that Indonesia is a developing economy. You can't expect it to embrace just the free trade principles unless you also develop their capacity to compete in a more open environment. And so therefore there is an important element of capacity building that is involved in the exercise. It's an important agreement for Australia. It's 300 million population, rising middle class, demand for protein, so therefore, and also preference for red meat and beef in particular. And the Australian brand is well recognised. What's hurting us at the moment, of course, is the price. And there's been a whole lot of market access issues that we've had to confront over the course of the last year in particular. We are seeking to inject into IACEPA important changes so far as the export of live is concerned, because this is a market in which we're not just exporting the animal, the commodity if you like, it is to build their capacity in feedlotting and ultimately in breeding. It's to build their capability to develop their own homegrown solutions to food security. Reality is they can't do it on their own, so it's ready-made for a strengthening partnership. I think the biggest challenge in terms of going forward with this is not just the nitty-gritty in terms of the negotiations, and they've been well advanced, but it's how we get better coordination. I think every one of us who have spoken here today and from the questions that have been made from the floor, there's recognition there has to be better coordination here. Well, that's also true in terms of our partnership with Indonesia. At the moment, they've got a requirement that for every animal exported, for every 5 animals exported, there should be 1 breeder. The trouble is there's no real follow-up for how that breeding can be successful by just putting them into feedlots. Now, we have a red meat partnership which is funding research work into different breeding programs. So we're hoping to segue that as part of the capacity building agenda that I talked about in the overall framework. But this is a huge opportunity for our relationship with Indonesia. The government here is committed to it. The President in Indonesia is committed to it, and they've identified the red meat sector as a key component because their challenge is food security. We're in the position in which we've got, it's our biggest market in terms of the live trade. There's established joint ventures in terms of the feedlotting operations, and there is currently important work going on alternatives to the breeding exercise than simply the 5-for-1. Their own research shows the 5-for-1 will not work. The question how the government responds to that, given it's made such a big pitch on price, so they see this as part of the solution, along with Indian buffalo meat and the like, but really, until you build their capability through a number of different fronts rather than mandated unworkable targets, that's really the challenge going ahead, and it's a really important focus of what we're engaged in with the government at the moment.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Simon. So you could say that it will cement the trade. Is that would be a fair comment, that the fluctuation should be taken out of the job now?
Yeah, I would hope so. It's interesting that to the 12 months rolling this year to October, we've had as many live, despite the disruptions, go in as last year. So despite the price impact and despite the disruptions, we're up to close to 600,000. The big problem going forward is next year is the year of reckoning on 5-to-1. So unless we can get an easing on that, that accountability is going to kick in a way which would be a massive disruption. I might just also add that the disruption that came at the end of last year saw a suspension of trade longer than the 2011 closure. So I say that not just for point of comparison, but to show the resilience of this sector, the importance of the Indonesian market to us, and the demand that's still there despite the price impact that's going forward. The price is good for producers, for sure. It's not good in terms of the export, and hence we get the disruption because they try to jiggle price through other means.
No worries. Thanks, Simon. Hey, just while I've got you and you're in full steam, the budget for LGAP was a little dodgy when I saw it. Is it being sorted out? Is it doable? I mean, you say it's going to be signed soon or something?
No. The budget for LGAP, we had to present to government our ability to make up, to show how it would be funded beyond the 8.3 million that the government has committed to. Part of our approach is to lock in that 8.3, because who knows when there's going to be an election. And I think, as always with these things, once you've got commitment, it's very hard to unpick. I don't think that we'll have a problem with the budget going forward. The issue has been getting buy-in. The problem with SCAS is that it puts all of the onus on the exporter. We've got to try and shift that, but you can't do that unless you improve control and traceability. Supply chain again, this is the linkages, getting people to take ownership when they've got responsibility and be accountable if they do the wrong thing. So getting the control and traceability is right,
yep.
But that's going to vary from market to market. Indonesia's less risk than Vietnam, for example. Middle East, in terms of live sheep, completely different market again. So no one size fits all, and the extra work that's needed is to identify the system appropriate for a particular market. That's what we've committed to do the extra work on, but we're also saying to the government, release the first tranche of money now so that we can get the structure set up that is going to administer this and require that point that I argued about before of extending that to acceptance of facilities in market and then the extension of adoption by other exporting countries.
Yep, righto. Thanks, Simon. Any questions? Yep, could you come up to the microphone, say your name and where you're from, please?
Thanks. I'm Mike Deckman. I'm from Yeppoon Grazing near Rockhampton, Central Queensland coast. Just on two things. I just wanted to speak on the welfare side. Why aren't we domestically advertising the fact first of the welfare of the on-farm animals throughout their life as a marketing tool, for one? so that we're actually showing the public that we care about animal welfare all the way through the animal's life. We don't see it openly advertised. It's usually the reactive issues that we're seeing. So I think it could start even earlier than what we're even talking about. You know, advertise like this animal's had a good life, doesn't matter what trait it's lived, and then through the processing system. So it's possibly another way of looking at it as well. Get there domestically more openly about it. The other thing that's an issue that's probably hard spoken about by all of us and the politicians, it may or may not be contentious, is where's the national support for farmers' use of firearms? It's being eroded nationally. I speak with experience because I'm actually an instructor and have been for 20 years. Primarily, prone production is where I do the training and help that process. So what we're seeing currently is, for example, in Queensland, the erosion of farmers' ability to carry handguns, semi-automatic firearms for particular uses in the right locations. It's about more so the humane and effective culling of sick, injured animals, the workplace health and safety of using appropriate tools in the appropriate environments for that specifically.
So the question is the ability for pastoralists to use firearms as their needs.
That's correct.
Yep. So Don, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll answer your both questions. I'll have a go. Firstly, one of the problems we've got around welfare is that people expect it. Sort of, it's an expectation of normal. So we've got to make sure that we don't undermine that people believe, and I think there's a trust in farmers generally, and that trust remains. I think the research MLA might talk about it later, but so farmers are trusted in relation to their animals. But if you look at the brands that are around the country, there's usually a fair bit of emphasis around, you know, the life those animals have led. Look, can we do it better than we are? Certainly. For example, it's been an issue that I've had with, particularly in education, where we haven't had sufficient focus on farming and agriculture in schools, and therefore the young people are picking up that farmers, you know, do nasty things to animals and environment, you know, and the reality is we don't. You know, we're the ones that protect them. The other reality is that, of course, Australia is not like it was, you know, 1,000 years ago. We've got feral animals, we've got, you know, in weeds, we've got all those things. And you people are the ones that actually do something about that and pay for it. So I've got to make sure that we do convey that information. The second part of the question, I'll answer two ways. One, the whole firearm issue is becoming very difficult to prosecute because of the things that happen, particularly in the United States. So governments will be very winky about dealing with it, unfortunately. But all I can say is that, you know, where there is legitimate reasons for use of different classes of firearms in particular around, you know, welfare of animals, then we should all protect that ability. I ran a feedlot, you know, for 10 years. And part of NFAS is euthanizing animals, and you are in fact trained, Tess. There's training modules to do that, and only specific people are trained to do it. So, you know, on farm, everybody in this room, or a lot of you have had to do all these things, and it's part of your day-to-day life. I don't know that I can help you change the politicians' minds because of the mass number of people in the cities who just don't understand. So there's more of them voting than us.
I think most of us understand that, but why aren't we having a national voice on this rather than just reactive from the state to state issue, or to lower political or newsworthy responses, when it could be on your agenda that it should be lobbied to the government for exactly the correct uses, and that there is a difference between these events that are occurring. Obviously Australia was on the trench back when, sadly, Port Arthur occurred. They were ready to go, so there was a change obviously coming then. And we all agree with the correct use of these things, and there's areas they shouldn't be. But in this environment which we work in, we should be making sure that the public are clear on there's a difference between those events the environment those weapons are in and the environment the weapons are in on the primary production area.
Thank you. And I'll certainly...
Can I just make a quick one,
yeah.
Chris? The ability, I see AgForce in Queensland has been very proactive on this. If you want national representation, you know, through SFO or others, we need to get a resolution from them to say that this is the issue and give us the evidence, and we can go and put it to our board and prosecute the case.
I agree with that entirely, but we've got national representation here.
All right. Yep, we can. We'll carry on. I'd like to change tact a bit if there's no further questions on the beef industry and, well, cattle per se. And Rick, goats. You fellas are having a boom time. Can you let us know what's going on with goats? And
I certainly can, Chris. Thank you. What I did notice in Alice Springs on the tourist map that there is a billy goat hill in Alice Springs, which led me to ask a few more questions, and the local from local people and pastoralists, and there is a history of goats in the area, small mobs, I believe, for milk and meat. So I'm not right out of my area. So that was good. Yeah, in answer to your question, Chris, we had an over the hooks high of $7.50 in July of this year, which I think most producers were happy with that. There was a correction, and the markets are always difficult to follow, but there was an increase in supply in August, or the end of July, August, and we saw that price come back. But we're currently at $5.40, and which is quite sustainable, and you know, we'll keep working on that, but it's still quite a decent price for goat meat. The period like that, and the reason for that price increase, well, there was just a steady increase in supply over 4 years, and the price just gradually rose to that point. Just to give you a bit of an idea where our markets are, where the main push behind that was from North America. And they take over 60% of our 1.8 million that we slaughter each year, and we also have a live export trade. But that to get to that 1.8 million, like it took 7 to 8 years before we were half of that. So we've doubled our production in that time. So you know, that's encouraging. So why did that happen is the question, or how did that happen? We're all happy, that we're always pleased to get high prices. For sure, it was to do with MLA and our marketing system, but also I need to add and mention, with quite more, or as important is the processes, individual processes going out into those markets and at times actually leading, as a goat industry council, actually putting us onto leads that we can follow up through our marketing, with our marketing levies. So we've got a lot to thank the processes for. And in saying, and as Don spoke of earlier, we work quite closely hand in hand with the processing industry. And also that, along with that marketing money or levies that were invested, we've got the integrity systems that we also spoke about earlier, which are critical and back that product. And 90% of the goat industry is harvested rangeland, so we've also got that clean green rangeland environment that these animals, these goats, are running in, which is a marketing tool, a very helpful marketing tool, and one we should cherish. So to move on, Chris, I don't like. I'm not a. Yeah, I can't pick the Melbourne Cup, but I don't know where we're heading. But at the minute, the indications are that we've got strong. Like the market at the minute is strong. and it should remain that way as our predictions on numbers. Actually, we're seeing, due to the high prices, we're seeing a levelling of numbers in Australia. So with that lack of increased supply, we're predicting that the price should remain firm, if not better.
So would we bail out of cattle and get into goats? No. Hey.
Just a few fencing issues, but I'm sure you'll get around it.
Righto. We have a question down here.
Thanks, Chairman. Ian McColl. Question to Simon. Simon is interested, I'm sure we'll get a wry smile out of this one, given the current interesting state of politics that we're facing. We will see a change of government in whatever the time frame is. I don't know that that matters that much. We will see a change, given that as James has said, that the Labor Party's come out and said they're going to establish an Office of Animal Welfare. Given also that we have a number of crossbenchers who have made their views on LiveX probably pretty clear, and therefore what that voting procedure may bring about, how do you see the live export industry facing that challenge?
Well, I think they should face up to it, not just directly, but with a degree of confidence that what they're doing, and that's what I tried to explain in response to James's earlier question, that we are on the front foot with this, and in many senses what we are seeking with the Global Assurance Program is to do the unfinished work that resulted from the SCAS implementation. We, of course, continue to engage with both sides of politics, and I think the Labor Party at ECA in Queensland earlier this year had a roundtable with members of all of the sectors across here. The Labor Party has indicated through Joel Fitzgibbon that they would engage with the stakeholders in terms of how they go forward with this. So we welcome that, and we would get in front. But let me also say that despite the detractors, this is a sector that still commands bipartisan support. And that's why this, as much as we can influence it, has to involve us moving forward, embracing change on industry's terms, but understanding where the pressures come at the political level. That's why we have been active in pushing for ACIL reviews, because quite frankly now the sort of research that we're getting back is the concern isn't so much with the practices at slaughter level. Indeed, we haven't had much of reaction to any of those incidents in a long time now. The concern is how, for example, animals are transported within the country. That's why we've got to look at all aspects of the supply chain. But I think that so long as we are doing it with the commitment that we've made, the principle of no fear, no pain for the animal, that's our objective. The MISP strategy, the Meat Industry Strategic Plan, which RMAC oversees, has identified the biggest risk to the sector, not just the live export sector, but to the production sector, is another outbreak of reaction to bad animal welfare practices. It's the reason why the biggest expenditure by LiveCorp, our service provider, is in addressing these sorts of issues. So I think that our commitment is to engage on an ongoing basis, but not wait to deal with a problem, to get ahead of the problem, to engage with stakeholders. And I take the point about the need to engage with the animal welfare activists. Some are harder to deal with than others, but engaging with them on the principle that we are about improving welfare practices from animals, not about closing the trade, because that's no solution. If we're the best in the world, you ask them this question: how do you improve animal welfare if you take us out of the equation? You don't improve standards, you lessen them. And so if we're leading in that path, there's got to be understanding, acceptance, support around that sort of direction. We had good engagement last week in WA with Alana McTiernan, who's the new Ag Minister in the Labor government there. we continue to engage with her because they're applying the same approach in terms of an Office of Animal Welfare. I think so long as we're identifying the path forward on our terms, recognising the problem and dealing with it, I don't think that we should be overly concerned of something being imposed that is something we can't cope with.
Yes, we have got concerns of this Independent Office for Animal Health. The problem with all these things, they start off with a great idea and then they become their own bureaucracy. And that's the concern that from our point that we have of this initiative. And I'm happy to, with the round table we had with Joel and others, we brought this up, and I'm happy from our point of view to work closely with Joel and the Labor government to see if we can get a solution here.
I think with this question, the devil will absolutely be in the detail. And I actually asked the question to Joel Fitzgibbon at that round table about what this Independent Office of Animal Welfare will look like, and that will be the industry's challenge, to keep in the discussions with Joel as to what exactly they intend the Office of Animal Welfare to look like.
Thanks, Tess. Look, we're rapidly running out of time. I just want to engage these fellows down the end here on this, on the processor side of things. The technical trade barriers to our industry, Lockie or James, is costing the industry a lot of money. How and where can we sort out the problems?
Yeah, thank you. Look, there's no doubt technical trade barriers or market access is one of our three major pillars for the processing sector, and our focus is very much on identifying the technical trade barriers that are restraining our trade. I think our government, the current government, is doing a fantastic job on these multilateral, bilateral trade agreements with Minister Chobo. And I think there's been some great results as a consequence of that, the most recent one with Peru. But when you open up doors, you also see doors close, and we're seeing this happening more and more. Industry estimates that we're losing potentially anywhere between $2.75 billion to $3 billion a year in lack of access to some of these markets through technical trade barriers. And these technical trade barriers can be a whole range of different things. It could be labelling requirements, it could be chilling requirements, it could be import requirements which are different to other countries, religious requirements, all adding either a significant cost to our processing to deliver a product overseas, or minimising the access to that particular market. So we've been prosecuting with this current government in the adoption of an IDC, an interdepartmental committee, a committee that represents three departments: the Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Trade, and the Department of Ag and Water Resources, because all three can actually add a lot to the arguments of identifying what those technical trade barriers are, and then working with industry to try and break down those technical trade barriers. Now, we've had very limited success in getting that across the board. The previous Ag Minister, who's currently going through his by-election, really is the roadblock in that regard. You'd be happy to note, and we talked about the possibility of a change of government, and it's up to our role here to prosecute to all corners of the government. We've got to make sure that our policies are getting carriage all the way through, and just recently the Labor Party issued a white paper on trade access, particularly into Southeast Asia, and they've pretty much picked up our policy on the IDC word for word. So this is an opposition government that is listening to this industry, and certainly it's still an opportunity for us to negotiate a similar outcome with the current one. So I don't know where the politics is going to land. I mean, obviously we're all aware of what the issues are happening down there. But we've just got to do our job and put in front of the politicians the decision making is the best way forward.
Good on you, thanks Lockie. Hey, I'm sorry Alan, we didn't get to talk about sheep. But you'll be happy to know there is the remnants of an old wool shed about 200 kilometres that way, but that was the end of the sheep industry. Look, that brings this session to a close.